welcome you to this workshop on the 5 disciplines of financially thriving churches. My name is Debi Nixon, and I serve on the staff at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. One of my roles is donor development, which encompasses daily interaction with our donors. I oversee the planning for our annual stewardship campaign, also capital campaigns, and I serve as one of the executive directors of our Resurrection Foundation. Given this scope of work, I'm not a donor development expert. I love our congregation, and I've developed strong relationships with our congregants. So my passion is helping others connect their generosity with their discipleship and experience how their resources are used in powerful ways as a part of God's work in the world. But the good news, we have a stewardship expert with us today who's going to help facilitate this workshop. So I'm going to be learning along with you, and I'm really excited about that. JoePark is the CEO of Horizons Stewardship. Joe and the Horizons team has served as a consultant to Church of the Resurrection and a friend to us for many years. So during our workshop today, I'll share some of the learnings and practices at Church of the Resurrection, while Joe's going to help us better understand current trends and principles and best practices that have been the most successful in churches across the country. Welcome, Joe. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Debbie. These slides you're about to see are the latest research from Giving USA. They reflect giving through the end of 2019. So let's begin by looking at how Americans are doing in the area of generosity. As you can see, over the past 40 years, Americans have continued to increase their giving in almost all non-recessionary periods, climbing all the way to $450 billion in 2019. This was an increase of 4% from 2018. Now, the gold columns show the years in which the U.S. had a recession. Over the past 35 years, giving has not only declined during each recession, it has taken several years after the recession to return to previous giving levels. Now, the U.S. economy has contracted by 33% annual rate in the second quarter of this year, which suggests we're going to see a significant decline in future giving. Nonprofit organizations are already starting to feel the pinch, and I expect that churches will begin to experience it in the latter part of this year. Based on the patterns of previous recessions, this recession is likely to impact giving not only in 2021, but for years to come. In this slide, we see individual giving over the past 40 years expressed as a percentage of disposable income. Disposable income is simply income after taxes are paid. As you can see, Americans have made little progress in becoming more generous over the past 40 years. Even in 2019, when disposable income increased by 4.3%, giving remained at a constant 1.9% of disposable income. There are 2 points that I want you to take away from the last 2 slides. First, the amount of giving to charitable causes has continued to grow. And the second point is that these increases are not an indication of Americans becoming more generous, but a reflection of Americans becoming more affluent. Because, as I pointed out earlier, over the past 40 years, as our income has risen, our giving has remained flat as a pancake at 2% of our disposable income. Now let's look at giving to religion. This slide shows the distribution of charitable dollars among all recipient categories. You can quickly see that religious organizations receive the largest portion of the contributions, around 29%. Now, this is nothing new. Religion has long received the greatest share of the charitable pie. However, this is changing. Although religion receives the largest share of charitable dollars, over the last 2 years recorded, that would be 2017 and 19, given to religion actually decreased in inflation-adjusted dollars by 1.7%. This is particularly disturbing because with the exception of foundations, all other giving categories grew during this period from 2.7% to 14.4%. Debbie, I wish I could share with you that this decline in religious giving was a one-time aberration, but sadly it's not. You can see on this side that contributions by recipients since 1980 in 5-year increments. As late as 1989, religion received close to 50% of all charitable giving. But since that point, we've been in a steady decline in giving to religion, and it's fallen all the way to 29% in 2019. In simple terms, the church is receiving about half the percent of U.S. charitable giving it was about 30 years ago. Debbie, how is it that you're seeing these trends play out at Church of the Resurrection?
Well, these are certainly interesting trends and things that we need to pay particular attention to. And while we have without a doubt experienced some of the effects of these trends here at our church, interestingly, our giving has seen some incremental increases in total giving. And so when I mention that, that's total giving across all areas of giving. So whether that's to our annual ministry or operating fund, capital, or designated giving for special ask. So when we drill down and ask the question, well, why is it that you're continuing to see these incremental increases? What we have found is that generous people, regardless of their income level, remain generous, particularly when there's a compelling need that must be met. Yes. And so I think that's something that for us that are in the local churches, when we're able to cast vision that has a clear message about what that donors' funds are going to be used and how it's going to help change others' lives, it helps to stir that donor's heart and it compels them to want to give. So that's actually what we're seeing here at Church of the Resurrection. And while we have seen some of the impact in downward giving when it comes to people losing their jobs and things like that, the other ways that we've seen some downward trends in giving, though, Joe, has to do with issues around divisiveness. So particularly issues around LGBTQ inclusion, or currently even issues around racial justice, have resulted in some of our donors making decisions to withhold their giving. Some think that we've gone too far one way. Others think that we haven't gone far enough. And so at this point, they just say, I can't continue to give to that church anymore. One of the things that we talk about, while these trends in the economy are really important inputs of data for us, as we begin to think about and anticipate what our donors might be doing, there are other factors, though, that we consider when it comes to trends in our giving. For example, another factor that we have found is that we have found this really strong correlation between engagement or participation in giving. In fact, our data has shown that the more engaged an individual is within the life of the church, the likelihood is that their giving is going to be higher. Now, this is an assumption that we could all make, actually, but we actually took the time to analyze this. And we were fortunate enough to have a volunteer who was actually not engaged beyond worship, who responded to a sermon that Adam gave that encouraged people to take another step and to volunteer using their passions and their gifts. And as it turned out, he was a data scientist. And so he contacted us and said, hey, I don't know if you can use this, but I would use my time to help you if there's anything you'd like analyzed. And so we had him compare then our donors and their amount of giving to their engagement. And can I tell you, the results of what we found out by spending the time to do that actually shocked us. We found that all things being equal, and using your estimate, Joe, that our donors might contribute 2% of their disposable income, a household with a disposable income, let's say of $50,000, attending 2 out of 4 Sundays, so 50% attendance a month, will give the exact same dollar amount as a household with a disposable income of $100,000 who only attends 1 out of 4 Sundays. So the household with the disposable income of $50,000 contributes $1,000, or 2%, and the household of $100,000 disposable income gives the same $1,000, or only 1%. We then took that analysis a bit farther and found that a household that is attending worship frequently and who is also engaged in small groups and or other service activities actually give 3 or 4% of their disposable income. So there is this direct correlation between the engagement of your donor and what it is that they give. Our learning then has shown us that we need to continue to improve the ways that we help our donors engage in the life of the church. And so that's been an inspiration for us to improve the ways that we get them on the discipleship pathway. You know, Joe, given the trends you've shared, and I've shared the divisive issues that have impacted our giving, I suspect that others that are listening are experiencing similar challenges. And so I'm wondering, are there other challenges that you're seeing that we, those of us in donor development, should be considering for 2021?
Yes. Most churches are enjoying a strong 2020 due to PPP loans and lower operating costs, but I'm deeply concerned about the challenges of funding the 2021 budget. Now, we've already covered two of the biggest, the impact the economic recession is going to play on future giving and the impact of donors shifting giving to other causes. But there's a lot more to be concerned about. In addition to exhausted staffs and uncertainties around COVID, churches are going to struggle with increased operating expenses that are necessary to build out effective digital ministry infrastructures. I believe that it will be increasingly rare for churches that worship over 100 to thrive if they do not fully embrace digital ministry strategies. Doing so with excellence is going to require additional funding for new skills and technology or the purposeful abandonment of many sacred cows. Now, abandoning sacred cows is not something that churches tend to do very well, but COVID has created an opportunity to provide for this change in a way that won't come again in a long time. Leaders, I hope you are listening and will not let this opportunity slip by you. But Debbie, what's really keeping me up at night is that too many churches are losing their connection with donors and they don't even know it. A recent Barna study found that 32% of practicing Christians have stopped attending the church that they were attending prior to COVID. 14% have switched churches, and another 18% are watching services of a different church. That means that only 35% of churchgoers who are actively engaging in the church that they were attending in March. Debbie, I get to speak to a lot of pastors each week, and when I do, I frequently ask them about their worship attendance. The response that I tend to get is a long silence followed by, well, I guess it's okay. What I usually hear in the ensuing conversation is that most are just guessing on attendance based on the number of viewer connections that they can see each week. The problem with just using online connections to measure worship attendance is that many of your committed members, especially boomers and builders, are now attending online more frequently than they did in person pre-COVID. Higher worship attendance is something you would be excited about with your older and most committed members, except in the churches that are not accurately measuring worship attendance, it's very likely that they're unaware of how many members they have actually seen drift away. Not only do surprisingly few churches have effective online registration systems, an even fewer number have developed strategies to measure engagement in small groups and service opportunities during COVID. Debbie, as you learned in your study, engagement is one of the most important factors driving giving. Unfortunately, most churches have scaled back or ceased important ministries such as small groups, Sunday schools, and opportunities to serve. Doing so, even if unavoidable, weakens many of their donors' motivations to give and stay connected with their church. So without an effective online registration system and some accurate means to measure engagement in discipleship and serving ministries, a church is largely blind to what's going on with their members. I'm also finding that stable 2020 giving is lulling too many churches into complacency. And here's the problem when using current giving as a measure of a donor's connection with the church. On average, it takes 3 to 6 months for someone to disengage their giving after they quit coming. So in other words, when someone quits coming to worship, on average, they wait another 3 to 4 months before stopping their giving. If churches don't take action now to reconnect with their most at-risk households, I fear many will not realize that these folks have moved on until they don't respond to their request for a 2021 estimate of giving. At that point, it's going to be too late.
So you have really confirmed this key learning that engagement is the key factor in donor giving. And so one of the things that we do is that we do take attendance. And so we ask our donors and all of our congregants to let us know that they're online. We incentivize them now. We're trying to find ways to get them to sign up by incentivizing them, letting them know that we might send them a free ebook, a complimentary ebook, or something like that as a way to really continue that. Another thing that we've done is that we reached out to our donors immediately when the stay-at-home orders started. We communicated particularly with our lead donors at that time. We wanted to assure them of all the things that we were doing to make certain that the church remained engaged while we worshiped online for what we thought was only going to be a couple of weeks. The email we sent to them started out something like this. I'm writing to reach out to each of our lead resurrection donors. This is an unprecedented time, and we've all been impacted. Some are on the front lines providing medical care for people. I'm praying daily for those in the medical field. Others are working to provide essential services. Others have seen businesses closed until the stay-in-place orders are lifted. As a church, we've been working to care for people, increasing our efforts to support our mission partners and ramping up ways to care for our congregation while maintaining social distancing. And then the letter went on. We shared specific ways we were responding that included our outreach to the community to provide food, encouragement to essential workers, particularly healthcare workers, and our intentionality to find ways to connect with those most isolated in nursing homes and senior adult living. We shared with those donors about the digital platforms we were deploying so that small groups could stay connected virtually and keep people engaged. Plus, new offerings such as daily live devotions and evening vespers online, all ways to keep our congregation connected with one another. Things we had not done before. And we shared about all the things that we were doing to increase our capacity for online worship. We also provided a financial update and assurance that we were working to reduce expenses wherever possible, closing off parts of our buildings, eliminating or postponing expenses for things that we didn't need at the time, and streamlining ministry. And then we were really honest and shared that while most of our donors were continuing their giving, we were beginning to see some of the economic impact, particularly because we were missing the offerings that would have come in the weekend offering plate. Many of you maybe experienced that as well. The letter closed by us thanking our donors for their continued faithfulness in giving and acknowledged that their giving was helping to carry the load of ministry during this time. We then invited them to share with us any ideas or suggestions they would have. And Joe, how did they respond? The outcome was that many of our lead donors made a decision on their own to complete their 2020 giving in the month of March. Having this unexpected income gave us confidence in our ability to move through the months ahead. And so, keeping donors informed and engaged is key. A second action that we took was to contact every person in our database within the first 2 weeks of the stay-at-home order to let them know how to access online worship, how to access other service and ministry opportunities, and we also gave them explicit details on how they could give online. This gave us the chance to pray with them when we had them on the phone or when we were emailing them and to discover any needs that they had. We did this first by making personal phone calls. We then followed up a month later with emails, and then we followed up this summer with handwritten letters. We have also helped donors set up online digital giving. Many of them had never done this before, and they just needed someone to walk them through how to do it. And then there were still others who just simply didn't want to give online, and they wanted to continue their giving by cash or check. So we installed secure boxes at all of our campuses so they could easily drop off their gifts in a safe, socially distant way. But Joe, this really, as we've talked about, it fits the 5 disciplines of churches who are thriving financially in spite of all the trends and challenges that we've just kind of covered. And so I think it's time for us, let's begin to walk through those and look into those a little bit more specifically.
Sure, Debbie. Horizons has been helping make disciples and fund ministry for 30 years. Our experience working with congregations of all sizes and across dozens of denominations has led us to identify 5 disciplines that are foundational to churches who are financially thriving today. Here they are. Keep it spiritual, tell your ministry impact story, build donor relationships, make the ask, and measure effectiveness. Underlying each of these disciplines is a series of best practices these churches use to grow generous disciples. I'll share about each discipline and highlight several of the most common practices, and then I'm going to ask Debbie to share a couple of examples that Church of the Resurrection is finding successful. Before we move on to the first discipline, I want to point out that you're not going to have much success in the application of these disciplines and best practices unless you built a firm foundation and have directional clarity. Now, your foundation are your core beliefs, mission, and commitment to discipleship. These are your what, why, and who statements in your church. It's rare to see a church that's thriving financially that does not walk the talk in all 3 of these areas. In fact, my belief is generosity is a byproduct of effective discipleship. I feel so strongly about that Horizons' mission is to help churches and faith-based nonprofits grow disciples, then fund ministry. Once your foundation is set, you must have a clear direction. And your direction is made up of your vision, your goals, and your strategies. Vision is simply where you're going. Goals create a picture of what success looks like, and strategies are your plans to achieve your goals. All the foundation and directional areas we've talked about, vision is usually the one most important to your donors. The first of the 5 disciplines is keeping it spiritual, and discipleship is at its core. Thriving churches overwhelmingly use a discipleship path or a set of spiritual practices that include generosity to guide their discipleship engagement strategy. Another best practice is the use of a well-articulated theology of generosity to share what your church believes the Bible says about giving, generosity, stewardship, and the connection between giving and growing into a committed disciple of Jesus. Clear expectations of church leadership, including giving, is extremely common in these churches. In fact, it is rare to see a financially thriving church that does not use giving as a crucial part of the vetting process for positions of leadership. The reason is simple. It's nearly impossible to have a healthy culture of generosity where the leaders do not exemplify what the church is asking of its members. In these churches, finance teams are rarely the tails that wag the dog. It is much more common for generosity to be driven by a multidisciplinary team made up of representatives from communication, worship, discipleship, serve ministries, finance, and church leadership. Horizons refers to this as a generosity team. They ensure that preaching, teaching, and celebrating generosity in all of its forms are included in worship year-round, in all church communications, in group studies, and in the orientation of new members. This group also oversees the generosity development strategies and executes the church's annual ministry funding plan. There is no season for generosity. It's always the season for generosity in the same way that it's always the season for worship, spiritual growth, and serving others. Debbie, how do you guys live into this at Church of the Resurrection?
This is so true, Joe. Discipleship is the foundation of generosity initiatives. And for us, we have a holistic approach in our discipleship pathway where generosity is one aspect of the 5 essential practices. Our 5 essential practices are worship, study, serve, give, and share. And they do not stand alone as separate activities or functions, but instead are essential to ministry at Church of the Resurrection. So while we have a team who's focused on donor development, specifically our role is that one-on-one interaction with donors where we're working alongside our worship, our communications, and our discipleship team, as you suggested, in this collaborative approach to create synergy. At Resurrection, we also know that keeping it spiritual is about connecting our donors' giving with the vision and mission of what God is calling the church to do. Often, we sometimes can focus on the mathematical exercise of communicating the tithe and teaching the tithe, which we know is the goal. It's the standard. And so we take that disposable income that we've discussed and we say, my disposable income is this, it's 10%. 10% of that equals X. But a spiritual discipline of generosity is so much more. It's about discovering and seeking and discerning what God is doing in that individual's life. And so when I sit down with a donor, I don't start with the message of the tithe. I suspect none of us do, actually. But to be honest, it's not even forefront in my mind even. The starting point for me is learning about what God is doing in the life of that donor. So I'm curious. I want to know more about their family. I want to know about their interest. I want to know what their passions are. I ask about their faith journey. And then in that, begin to help them connect their giving to their spiritual journey. I tell our donors that my role is to help them be stewards of their resources for greatest impact as they seek to be faithful to what God's calling them to do. For some, they're just getting started, and for others, they're looking for even more ways to be generous. One of the best ways I think that we can help our donors see themselves in the story of generosity is when they hear stories of others and what they're doing, and they're inspired to do the same. And so, Joe, can you help us understand that spiritual practice of story sharing?
Absolutely. The second discipline is looking for every opportunity to share stories of ministry impact that effectively communicate how the church is transforming lives. Doing so cuts the destructive message that culture sends about money and connects giving and the impact that it makes possible. In churches who do this well, telling stories of impact permeates all channels of their communication. They avoid the trap of making the story about a lot of facts and figures. Instead, they focus as much as possible on telling the story of a single life that has been changed and use the data points to demonstrate how many other stories like this one exist because of the donor's generosity. Now, apart from sermons, quite possibly the most effective application of this discipline is the effective use of weekly offering talks, where stories of ministry impact are shared and your church's theology of generosity is explored and celebrated. Offering talks can also be used as teaching moments to share gratitude, to celebrate wins, to challenge individuals to take the next step on their spiritual journey toward generosity, as well as demonstrating fiscal accountability and transparency. When communicating, thriving churches will frequently use donor-centric words and phrases such as ministry funding plan in place of operating budget, or investment in place of expense. Because they recognize that each donor is an individual with unique motivations and behaviors, they invest in systems which allow them to personalize and segment communications based on behaviors, involvement, and interest. Debbie, I know this is something that you guys do well here at Church of the Resurrection.
Well, we're blessed because we have an incredible communicator at Resurrection and our senior pastor, Adam Hamilton. So each week, his sermons share stories about impact and life change. And each worship service includes this opportunity to give. Donors need to know exactly how to do this, and we need to make it easy for them. So we give very specific instructions. During the time that we have solely been online and even broadcasting now locally on TV, our invitation first starts with something like this. If you're a part of another church, we want you to give to your local church. They need your giving. But if Resurrection is your church home, we invite you to give and to give generously by texting COR to 77977. So again, being very specific and letting people know how to give is important. Then we send personalized letters to every first-time donor, and we use their first names to thank them. We do this so that they know it's not a standardized letter or a form letter, but instead it's personal. And we reference the ways that their gift will be used and employed in ministry that month, thanking them for the difference their gift is going to make. So that's a way that we share story. It's time consuming to do all of those personalized emails or letters, but it does give me, the one who is overseeing donor development, the opportunity to personally pray over each donor as I hand sign those letters and I thank God for their generosity and continue to pray for God's work in their lives. While most of the letters, I have to admit, are hand or typed because my handwriting is so bad, I do include a short handwritten note on the side of each letter as I'm signing my name. So it also just confirms that the letter is not a form letter to our donors. Other things that we do share facts and figures, Joe, but we do it, for instance, by saying, this is how many pounds of food were purchased because of your generosity this month, or this is how many children were impacted by a school supply drive, or how many villages will receive clean water as a result of the donations for wells for Africa. But each fact or figure is connected then to one or two personal stories. Now, we have a lot of room for improvement in how we share stories during the offering. And your reminder, as you've shared with us now, as one of these practices, is actually a challenge for me that we need to continue to make this a priority. And we are working with you, Joe, and the Horizons team because we want to improve the way we share stories on our website and the ways that we talk about this spirituality and this theology of generosity as we improve our digital and online storytelling. So all of this helps us build relationships with our donors. And I think it's time for us to talk more about how we build donor relationships.
A church relationship with its financial supporters is sacred and requires cultivation. Pastors and key staff must have access to and actively use donor giving records for the purpose of developing generosity. Financially thriving churches tend to aggressively seek to identify people with high capacities of talent, time, and financial resources. Once identified, they're intentional about seeking to build authentic, personal relationships. The appropriate motivation for these relationships is to seek something for these people, such as joyful giving and serving, spiritual growth, or a meaningful life, rather than simply as a means to get resources from them. This is done by cultivating personal relationships, learning their passions, motivations, and stories, by asking them for their wisdom and inviting them to serve in ways that fit their passions, giftedness, and time availability. Only when this has occurred are you fully prepared to make an individual financial ask. These churches also tend to have made investments in technology and systems that allow expressing gratitude to donors quickly and in a personalized way. Debbie, as you pointed out, it's hard and it's expensive to do this well, but the return on investment is significant. The idea is to catch someone behaving in a way the church wants repeated and then to appropriately thank them. Some common examples are when someone joins a small group, serves or gives for the first time, or signs up for recurring giving. Or when somebody has a positive change in their giving patterns, or maybe they passed a threshold, such as completing 50% of their estimate of giving. Thriving churches also embrace a donor-centric attitude, meaning they communicate in a way that speaks to the donor's feelings, interests, and motivations versus to the needs of the church. An example of this would be thanking a donor for making it possible for a Nixon elementary school student to have enough food over the weekend, instead of saying something like, "Thank you for your $100 gift to the church's backpack program."
Joe, you really hit on some of the key actions that I have mentioned before, and that is why we send out these personalized thank you emails or letters to every first-time donor, catching them when they make that first attempt at an online gift or they put cash or a check into the offering plate. Mm-hmm. But we also send thank you notes to donors who give beyond a designated threshold, and you mentioned that. That threshold might be different for each local church. For some of you, you may want to set a threshold of $100 or $500 or $5,000, but it's a number that helps you be alert to something extraordinary that your donor has done. I really like your idea also of sending out a letter for other thresholds, like a thank you for reaching one half of your giving for the year or when they've completed their gift for the year. And so that's something I want to start incorporating here at Church of the Resurrection. Another way that we keep our donors informed is through quarterly statements. The quarterly statement is a way for us to express gratitude to our donors. It also shares the way that the donor's giving is making an impact while providing information that lets the donor know how they're progressing on their giving commitment for the year. I mentioned earlier of our learning that there's this direct correlation between a donor's giving and their engagement. So, as you talked about, we do keep track of our donors' weekly worship attendance and their small group and service activity. And we have a system that contacts anyone who misses 4 weeks in a row with a message that prioritizes re-engagement in worship or their service or their small group over giving. If someone has stopped an activity and stopped attending, we don't want our next message to them to be that ask for their annual giving commitment. Donors also like to be involved in the decision-making and development of strategies. This gives them ownership, so we host listening sessions and we conduct surveys to get their feedback. And like most churches, we really prioritize that work and that development of our lead donors because our lead donors do account for a significant percentage of our giving. So, as I mentioned, we did communicate with them at a very high level when the stay-at-home orders first occurred. But throughout the year, we send special emails to them. And yearly, we host a gathering just for our lead donors that's hosted by our senior pastor and his wife. Last year, we also identified a few households that we believed should be lead donors, but they were not currently giving at that level. And we included them in one of these lead donor events. So we treated them like they were a lead donor. And you know what the result was? 100% of them increased their giving last year. We also, at time, will give small tokens of appreciation to our donors. So maybe we'll send a certificate to purchase a Tippin's Pie, which is a local pie bakery here in Kansas City. The cost is small, but the impact of that small gesture and that gift is really huge. I also want to take a moment to remind all of us of the importance of prompt follow-up with donors. Follow-up with donors is critical. And so for me, I've set a standard for myself that I'm going to make it a priority to follow up with any donors who contact me within 24 hours at the most. And to be honest, most of those donors are going to get followed up within the hour. The reason that this is so important is because over the past several months, while everyone has been online and church doors have been closed, we have actually received a few gifts from donors outside of Church of the Resurrection who simply said that after multiple attempts of trying to contact their local church to see how they could help, no one has yet to follow up with them, and they wanted to know if their resources could be deployed. I also have a member of our church, Joe, who has a sizable estate gift that they would like to leave at the time of their passing. And their intent was to leave a portion of that gift to their childhood church in a rural farming community. But over the last few years, as they've been working to get their estate plans settled with their will and their trust, the attempts to reach someone to talk to at this church about that gift has resulted in no return phone call. So they have decided now at this time that their entire gift is going to be redirected. So I suspect for some of our churches, we just simply haven't developed a system that ensures that those messages are getting to the right person, particularly if you're the senior pastor. And so that might be one action step you want to take away from our time together today, is to make certain that you've got great processes in place, that you know that all of those messages are getting directly to you so that you can follow up promptly. You know, Joe, most people are likely to grow in their generosity when they're challenged to take their next step. And so help us learn how to make the ask.
Absolutely. So thriving churches understand just what you said, that most people will grow in generosity when they're challenged to take that next spiritual step. They ask with confidence, knowing that while they will not always get everything they ask for, it is rare to receive anything that they have failed to ask for. They also embrace the idea that the perfect invitation is one that's made by the right person to the right person for the right gift at the right time. When making individual invitations for a gift, they understand the donor's interest, propensity to give, and capacity to give because they come to know that individual through a personal relationship and they've done the hard work of preparing before making an ask. When making ask of larger groups, they ensure every effort has been made to connect what is being asked for to the fulfillment of the church's mission, vision, the donor's spiritual journey, and the anticipated impact of the gift. They invite questions and are clear about what's being asked for, when the donor is asked to respond, and what the next step will be if they do not respond. Only those who are generous are involved in asking persons to give, and they avoid using pressure or guilt or sounding desperate when they're asking. They're simply inviting a potential donor to prayerfully consider God's leading and their invitation to give. Sharing our vision, goals, and strategy, which are often called a case for support, is simply inviting someone to join us in our God-inspired mission. Henry Nouwen says it this way: fundraising is proclaiming what we believe in such a way that we offer people the opportunity to participate with us in our vision and mission. Funding is precisely the opposite of begging. When we seek to raise funds, we are not saying, please help us because it's been hard lately. Rather, we're declaring that we have a vision. It's amazing and exciting, and we're inviting you to invest yourself through the resources that God has given you, your energy, your prayers, and your money in this work that God has called us to complete. Debbie, you guys have got some great things happening around this. Why don't you share some of them with us?
Well, we have a few different ways that we make the ask, but for me, the main obstacle is to overcome that confidence in the invitation. And I've had to remember that through prayerful consideration that you mentioned, I'm simply just a conduit in what God is doing. It's not about me. It's not about fundraising. It's about what God is inviting the donor to do and what God is calling us to do collectively. That's where the clarity of vision and mission and generosity collide. A few tangible ways we do this include a yearly stewardship sermon series, must always in November, to invite the entire congregation to prayerfully consider what God is calling them to commit to in the following year's operating budget, which we have now changed that name, not the operating budget anymore, but the ministry fund. Yes, we are still one of those congregations that does ask our congregants to complete a commitment card, and that helps give input for the ministry budget, but it does not determine our budget. So why do we do it? We do it because we believe that completing that commitment card is a spiritual practice. It's an act of discipleship that calls our congregation, each one of us individually, to actually spend the time discerning what God's calling us to do, and then we respond and make that commitment because we write it down. And as I mentioned before, one thing that we are changing immediately, and you've heard Joe mention it today, we are changing the name of our funds from the operating fund to a ministry fund. This is something I was really challenged by listening to Joe and all of his talks. We agree with you, Joe, that this communicates more about the outcome of the donor's gift and its impact to ministry versus operating, and that's much more compelling. We are also challenging our donors almost every year with a step-up ask by encouraging them to give a specific amount more than they did last year. And so if someone's never given before, our invitation is to say simply, you know what, why don't you begin giving? And we set a modest but tangible amount, such as something like, for the cost of purchasing a coffee each week, you could start making the difference in the lives of others. Several times throughout the year, we also do special asks above and beyond our donors' annual commitments of giving. Examples might be in response to funds needed for disaster relief or backpack, school drives, or hunger-related needs in the community. And during these asks, donors are reminded that these gifts are above and beyond their normal giving to that ministry fund. And every year, we give away 100% of our Christmas Eve offering. For many, this becomes their first time ever to give, and it sends a message that the church is committed to being the church, the hands and feet of Christ in the community. It begins to create this trust between those who are just starting to develop a relationship with the church, and it helps them begin to see their giving as a part of that work. I also want to mention that we do ask our new members to make a commitment. And so at all of our new member classes, once they started that, we then hand them a commitment card and ask them to fill that out. That's another place that we make an ask, and we incentivize them by letting them know that when they turn that commitment card in, we're going to give them a tangible gift of a study Bible. And we have found that that's just been one of the ways that they've wanted to get involved. Making ask of these lead donors is also something that I've had to learn how to do a little bit better. And for example, we had a lead donor that had kind of given us a hint that they had an interest in giving a significant gift, but didn't really tell us a whole lot about where their passions were. And so over the last year or so, I'd been meeting with them, getting to know them a bit more, but no gift had ever materialized. And then over the past few months, when our need to increase technology within our church in response to the pandemic occurred, I remembered that they owned a digital technology company. And so mentioned that to my senior pastor, Adam. We called them. We invited them in for conversation. We explained the need and asked if they had any advice based on their experience in the industry of what we could be doing to increase our technology. They provided their advice, and then when we asked, well, would that be something that you would want to fund? The response that I received back from them was, you have finally hit me where our passion is, and the answer is yes. There's a lot more that I could share, but I'll end with this. We also do a end of the year ask, and so that's something that you may want to deploy if it's not something you have been regularly doing. And here's the reason why. Around the second or third week of December, we'll send out an email to all of our donors with an invitation for that year-end gift. Again, the reason why is because they are receiving the same invitation from hundreds of other charities in your community. And we have found that your donors want to be generous and they will give to those who are making the ask. So we have to have that confidence in making the ask. Joe, we have discussed great principles and practices. But how are we going to know if all these things that we are doing are actually effective?
One of the main reasons for the massive shift in giving from religion to other nonprofits is the failure of the church to accurately measure and share our impact of ministry. The greater the gift capacity of the donor, the more likely they are to ask hard questions about how the gift will be used and how the church will measure the return on the investment that the donor is being asked to make. It is precisely these high-capacity donors who are responsible for much of the shift in giving from the church to other nonprofits whose asks they find more compelling. As we're about to learn, we need their support now more than ever. There's been a lot of donors who have dropped out of the giving process in the last 10 years, but more significantly, since 1989, there's been a 17% shift in the wealth from the bottom 90% of households to the upper 10%. Recent changes in tax codes have created a new normal where wealth is increasingly being concentrated in the top 1% of households. Consequently, many churches' ministry funding is becoming increasingly dependent on high-capacity donors who already tend to share only a minority of their charitable giving to religious causes. To maintain and grow these donors' giving, it is increasingly important for them to hear in person a compelling vision with a clearly articulated and measurable results. Guilt and a desire to support the institution of the church are no longer effective motivators to increase giving. Thriving churches have learned to measure and communicate life change stories which are heavily supported with data points. High-capacity donors are no longer satisfied with us just sharing inputs like the amount of money or resources we've invested or the number of people that showed up at an event. Thriving churches have learned to measure and share the actual difference that is being made through their ministries. Because a primary mission of the church is to make disciples, measuring movement along the discipleship path has become a foundational metric for thriving churches to demonstrate the effectiveness of their discipleship strategies. Almost all financially thriving churches are using donor analytics to measure individual movement and giving. Sometimes sufficient information can be extracted from the church management software that the church is already using, but increasingly churches are choosing to use one of the many donor analytic software programs that can now be purchased for as little as $99 a month. These programs assemble the data or the donor data that the church is already collecting into easy to understand dashboards, reports, and triggers. One of the other major benefits of these programs is that the needed information is directly accessible to pastors and authorized staff without having to make requests from the finance office or the church financial secretary. It's now affordable for most churches to provide their leadership the same level of detail on giving as they are used to providing around expense controls. Debbie, tell us how you guys are dealing with measuring effectiveness here at Church of the Resurrection.
We do some measurements, such as analyzing the results of our annual stewardship campaign. And so, for instance, we know the number that was on the target list. And so we begin to analyze how many was on our target list and how many actually made a commitment. Did they step up? Did they do that step up ask? And then what do we learn from that? From then, we take that information and figure out strategies to help them on the discipleship pathway. Another area that we're working is that we want to get more analytics on how our donors are giving. Mm-hmm. So we want to know, are they doing recurring giving online? Are they doing it through an EFT? Are they doing it through their IRA required minimum distributions or stock transfers or family foundations? So this is a new analytic that we hope to have more statistics on, which we believe will help us as we personalize and improve our donor communication. And as I've already mentioned, we have found that you can correlate donor giving to their engagement. So I want to encourage every church to find ways to keep track of congregant attendance and participation. That is such a key measurement and analytic that we all have to be effective in this role of donor development. And I tell you, you've really inspired me today. I'm thinking about this $99 a month that we might be able to really increase our ability to see how our donors are progressing. And so I'm really looking forward to exploring more of that donor analytics software options and measuring our effectiveness in the areas as we continue to grow in this as well. Wow, Joe, this has been a lot of information. So I want to thank you for your time today. Knowing trends helps us best prepare for these next few years ahead. And while they may indicate that there are some rooms for concern, I got to let you know that for me, to be honest, I see this as a discipleship opportunity because we serve a God who's able to do more than we ever imagined or could take hold of from what he's calling us to do. And I believe these 5 disciplines that you've shared with us today, to keep it spiritual, to tell ministry impact stories, to build donor relationships, and to make the acts, and then measure effectiveness, are those opportunities that we need to seize and see what God's going to do next. And so I'm wondering if there's other resources that you might recommend to us. And then would you close us out in prayer today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Debbie. I'd like to invite everyone to sign up for free access to Horizons online resource library. We call it Giving 365. Is full of hundreds of videos, blogs, articles, and webinars, all focused on making disciples and funding ministry. You can sign up today at giving365.com. Debbie, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you in this presentation.
Thank you.
Let's pray. God, we thank you for the resources that you have allowed us to steward, to be in this work of seeing the world that you imagine come to be. We pray for wisdom and discernment for those who are listening, that you would move in their spirit and help them to identify the changes that you would have made so that that disciples can be made and the world can be changed. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.